You know, for a film called The Time Machine, it's not actually really about time travel. I'm of course talking about 1960's The Time Machine, directed by George Pal and based on the 1895 novella of the same name. This film stars Rod Taylor, Alan Young and a very young Yvette Mimieux. So young in fact, she was underage when they started filming it, hitting 18 in mid-production. The film was released on August 17th, 1960 and made $2.61 million on a budget of 829 grand. The film follows a Victorian inventor who has crafted himself the titular time machine and embarks on an adventure through time, not space, to the year 802,701. Try saying that after you've had a few. During this journey, he stops off in the year 1917, where he meets a man named James, who turns out to be the son of his best friend, who has tragically died in the First World War. This depresses George greatly, so he decides to move further forward in time, and not realising that the second instalment in a trilogy is often the best part, he decides to skip World War II and land right at the beginning of World War III. The time travel sequence that we get here is a real treat because we get some of the best time-lapse photography ever. There's the iconic scene with the mannequin, which is used to illustrate time travel by showing George, our time traveller, the changing tastes in women's fashions. We also get some really nice images of flowers blossoming and pieces of fruit growing on trees and stuff. Now, I thought this was done by stop motion. In actual fact, I found out that this wasn't the case. These are paintings made frame by frame to illustrate the different stages of plant growth. Absolutely beautiful to look at. These are in actual fact done by the same artist who was in charge of making all the matte paintings for the film. So as I mentioned, George finds himself at the beginning of World War III. He's in the year 1966, swinging London that in no way resembles a studio set in California. Take it from me, I'm a Londoner. And as soon as George exits his time machine, he is almost straight away ushered into a bomb shelter. It is that close to World War III. In actual fact, the air raid wardens in this scene are wearing the same uniforms as the C-57D crew from Forbidden Planet, in the first of two references to that film here. The other one we get later on in the library scene, when George walks past the big navigational sphere thing that they've got in the middle of the flight deck on the C-57D spaceship. George is then caught up in a nuclear explosion that is of such greater magnitude that it sets off a volcanic eruption in the centre of London. And we get another fantastic special effects shot here of this volcano destroying London, famously made of oatmeal and food colouring. So George is forced to travel even further and faster through time because he has been buried under a mountain. So his only hope for escape is to travel so far forward in time that the mountain will get naturally eroded away. And it does, and he finds himself in what seems to be a very idyllic setting, when in actual fact it's far from it, because humanity has diverged into two species: the very soft and very weak, almost cattle-like Eloi, and the evil subterranean dwelling Morlocks. And to make matters worse, the Morlocks have stolen his time machine, as well as the bird he really fancies. George manages to defeat the Morlocks, recover his time machine, and free the Eloi. He briefly returns back to Victorian London, where he recovers 3 books, but you're very deliberately left guessing as to which 3 books he chooses, before returning to the future to make a new life and a new civilization for himself. So this film can trace its roots back to 1953, because George Pal had just made War of the Worlds, and the estate of H.G. Wells were so delighted with the film that they approached George Pal and said, well, do you want to do another one? And he jumped at the chance, like straight off the bat. He was like, yeah, cool, I want to do the time machine. It was only the critical and commercial failure of Conquest of Space that put the kibosh on this plan for a few years. In the end, he took the project to MGM, who farmed the project out to their British division, although bizarrely insisted that it had to be produced in the United States. So yeah, the film was made by the British division of MGM, but it was filmed entirely in the United States. But before I move on any further, please hit the like and subscribe button, because that really helps the channel out. Also, you can give me a follow on X, and if you're that way inclined, you can even find me on Facebook. For me, any adaptation of The Time Machine is going to be a ballsy move, because the central themes in that novella are so baked into its DNA that no matter what you do with it, they will still be there. And one of the central themes to this book is that of class warfare. So to really understand those themes, you need to bear in mind that this book was written in 1895. And in them days, the people that did the most reading were of the middle and upper classes. And society itself was deeply split between the working, middle and upper classes. And it was the middle classes in particular who deeply loathed foreigners and were deeply fearful of the working class. H.G. Wells himself came from a very working class background. His father was a gardener, part-time shopkeeper and professional cricket player, whilst his mother was a domestic servant. All very working class occupations, even the cricket player element to it. Sports were seen as a very working class profession. I've even heard it argued that the modern Olympics were founded as an amateur event entirely to keep the working classes out. Although I have not actually seen this confirmed in writing anywhere. So at best, this is conjecture. But this does help illustrate my point that H.G. Wells was writing at a time when British culture was filled with huge amounts of class prejudice. And when he's writing about the peaceful Eloi that are ostensibly leading a very carefree and very pampered existence, whose every need is met by this subterranean dwelling mutant species of half-humans that grow all the food and run all the machinery and only come to the surface at night to feast on the very flesh of the surface dwellers. So yeah, in its context, it's easy to see what Wells is trying to say, especially with that sledgehammer motif of the Morlocks quite literally eating the rich. This also explains the longevity of the story as well, because to the Victorian person reading this book for the first time, it would have very subtly frightened them and put its claws right into their heads, leaving them very unsettled after reading it. So when I say adapting the time machine is a ballsy move, it's because by the time 1960 come around, all of those themes, every single one of them, everything I just said, would have been totally irrelevant. It would have been irrelevant in the United Kingdom because class prejudice in this country was about to go on hiatus for about 30 years. And in the US as well, it would have been even more irrelevant because their society isn't class bound like ours. So what do? Well, you make a really ballsy move. You take all of those themes and you chuck them out the door. And then you start thinking in a more contemporary context. Because what George Powell did was genius. He took a book which was about class warfare and turned it into a film which is just about warfare. Specifically in this case, Cold Warfare. So throughout the first half of this film, you get this sort of sense that war is looming. There's this constant theme going on, that war is just on the horizon. Starting at the very beginning of the film, when they're all sat round after dinner, all being very sceptical about George's new invention, making statements such as, maybe he's invented a new clock, one that will be very useful for the artillery, and that maybe this time machine is all folly, and that he should get a real job in the War Office. And it's no accident that he stops right at the very outbreak of the Third World War, again letting the viewer know that in this film at least, war is imminent. And this was reflecting some very real world fears they had at the time. The First World War was very much in living memory. The Second World War started 21 years before this film was made. And put that in perspective, 21 years ago from today was 2003, so not very long at all really. They had the Korean War just a few short years before, and in another very few short years they was about to enter the Vietnam War. But it wasn't this they was afraid of. They was afraid of the big one, that third global conflict, this time with the Soviet Union. It's the reason it is stated so clearly in the film that this conflict is between East and West. So in that context, the Morlocks become the Soviets, and the Eloi become the Western nations. So this film does reflect some very real world fears over that conflict, but it also serves as a warning as well, because as I mentioned, the first part of this film, there's constant references to this looming conflict, but it's the tone in which they speak about it, because it's almost enthusiasm they've got for it. When they assume it's just a clock George has made for the artillery, they're very upbeat and positive about this idea. And they talk about the Boer War, which to their eyes in 1900 was a very real thing that was happening at that moment. Yet they seem, again, enthusiastic about it. They like the idea that George is going to go and work for the War Office and come up with some dastardly machine that's going to speed this war along. Even when George stops off in the First World War, when he learns from Jamie that his best friend Philby has just died, Jamie is his son, but he says it without a hint of melancholy and the utmost pride. So on the one hand, the director's telling you that, hey, war is often met with enthusiasm, and on the other hand, he's showing you the dangers of it, he's showing you the follies of it, and then he goes on to demonstrate to you just what mankind can descend into. So jettisoning all of those themes around class warfare was very deftly done. And then it was replaced with some really, really contemporary fears and contemporary themes. George Powell was a genius, but there is something else going on here in this film, and it's very subtle. And it's all to do with the characterisation of the Eloi, because they are portrayed as completely ineffective and completely nihilistic, to the point that they can't even make fire, because they've never even seen fire. Now, fire was the thing that elevated us from the beasts. So yes, on a certain level, George Powell is basically saying yes to Eloi are literal cattle. But he's saying two more things that are very profound. And if this film did have a hidden message, these two things would be it. So he's looking at contemporary youth culture. He's looking at those beatnik kids that he sees every day outside the studio. And before I move any further with this, yes, Yvette Mimieux was deliberately cast because of her youth, for the reasons I'm about to outline. There's that famous scene in this film where the air raid sirens go off and the Eloi go into this trance-like state, and they all, without resistance, march straight into the Sphinx to be eaten by the Morlocks. That is a direct statement about nihilism and the way that it was entering youth culture at the time. The character of Weena herself has a very nihilistic outlook on life. She says categorically, there is no future and there is no past. And that reflects a very real world sentiment, because at that point in American history, for 10 solid years, they'd lived in a complete consumerist utopia. So what George Powell is saying here is this: we've got this generation of kids that have no identity, they have no connection to anybody or anything. They are completely nihilistic. And the danger here is this: when you are like that, when you have no identity and no connection, that's when some very unscrupulous people can come in and they can take advantage of you. And from then on, it's only bad things that can happen to you. And that's what that scene's all about, because George is the only grown-up in the room at this point, and he's screaming at these kids to stop, to listen to him. Don't go into the Sphinx. But he's also doing something else, and this is even more subtle, because he's reaching back to a film he made nearly 10 years before this. So in 1951, he produced the film When Worlds Collide, and I made a video about it not too long ago. It's actually the third most popular video on this channel. And in that video, I hypothesised that what George Powell was saying in that film was very simple. It was that the American pioneer spirit can defeat anything. But what he does here in the time machine is almost like he's meditating on the subject again, because he's revisiting it 10 years later, and what he's discovered has disturbed him. Because a short 10 years ago, there was no doubt on earth that because of America and its pioneer spirit, it was going to defeat communism. There was no doubt in his mind. But now, 10 years later, he's looking at the kids and he's seeing their nihilistic outlook on life, and he's saying this generation is not ready for what's coming to it, because they've lost that pioneer spirit. They've lost that what makes them American. Quite literally, what kind of cowboy don't know how to start a fire? So he's warning the viewer. He's saying we're not in a good place at the moment, because if it kicks off, the Soviets will literally make mincemeat of these kids. You could argue this film has a very conservative message. So those are my thoughts on this film. The class warfare DNA is so strong that even with the amount of it that was thrown out, you can still look at the film through that lens. You can also quite easily view it through the Cold War lens, with a very strong anti-war message. And there is no doubt in it, that's what this film is about. But the latter scenes in the film with those Eloi kids, I definitely think that's what George Powell was getting at, especially in the context of his other work. But, as I always say, this is just a personal view. Please hit the like and subscribe button. And, as I mentioned earlier on, give me a follow on X. Or, you can join my Facebook group. I'll put the links in the description for you.